I want to go ahead and bring in Matthew, who is following. He is one of the directors of media and communications, Matthew Waterfield. Thank you so much for your time.
Not a problem. Good to be here today.
You know, sometimes when police detectives get on a case, the answers come relatively quickly, but we all know that there are plenty of families out there who wait days, weeks, years for answers and have some semblance of what happened to their loved ones. And I know that's where you all come in with the DNA Doe Project. We're talking about 71-year-old Dorothy Glanton today, who left her home in Chicago on December 9th, 1987, and never returned. Fill me in on more of the details in that case.
Sure. So we were brought onto a case of a woman who had been found dead in New Buffalo back in 1988. She had washed up on the shores of Lake Michigan and nobody knew who she was. She was actually initially believed to be a Caucasian woman between the ages of 35 and 45. So it came as a bit of a surprise when her DNA came through and it turned out she was African American. But it's something we sometimes see with these older cases. So a research team was assigned to the case. We actually began working on the case in person at a location in New Jersey back in summer 2023. And after that, we worked remotely from all parts of the world. There was an international team on this. And after our 8 weeks of research, we identified a candidate in the case, and that candidate was Dorothy Glanton, who, as it happens, had gone missing from Michigan in December 1987.
Yeah. You know, this case, as I understand it, has ties to the Great Migration and even enslavement. Take me back to that. How does it go back to those things?
So when we work on a case, we usually only have quite distant DNA matches to work with. And sometimes on African American cases, that can present a bit of a challenge. If the closest DNA matches we have are people whose common ancestors with our John and Jane Doe are from the 1700s or the early 1800s, that may be during the period of enslavement where the records just aren't available to us. So it was pretty tricky. We could see a number of families who our Jane Doe is connected to, but we struggled to tie the pieces together until one of the smaller DNA matches, we began working on his family tree and we began looking into his great grandmother and her family. And we found that a branch of her family had moved from Alabama to Chicago in the early 1920s. Because we knew that the Jane Doe might have been from Chicago based on where she washed up, that was pretty interesting to us. So we homed in on that family. And that was when we came across Dorothy, who was born in Alabama, but who had come to Chicago along with many other African Americans back in the early 1920s. So we were a little bit suspicious as to whether or not it was her, considering the age range that we had in mind was 35 to 45, and Dorothy would have been in her 70s at the time that this Jane Doe's body washed up in Lake Michigan. But it later turned out she had disappeared from Chicago just 4 months prior, and at that point we were pretty confident that we did indeed have the right person.
Wow. You know, so many years later, there are still a lot of concerns regarding the treatment of cases regarding missing black women and girls. There are whole podcasts dedicated to that particular topic. What does that say to you?
I think that in the past there's often been a sense that cases of missing people, regardless of race, but often specifically with African Americans, maybe weren't taken as seriously 40, 50 years ago as they should have been. We've certainly heard that from families in other cases that we've worked on. While I can't comment on the specifics of Dorothy's case, I think it is a powerful reminder of the technology we have these days to reunite people with their identities, and how, regardless of ethnic background, whether the Doe is Caucasian or Hispanic or African American, there are different challenges that face us as genealogists as we work with those from different communities, but it is possible to overcome those challenges. And the more people from different populations that upload their DNA data to the databases we have access to, the likelier it is that we'll be able to identify people from those populations. So in Dorothy's case, it was really one match that made all the difference.
Wow.
He likely had no idea that he was related to a Jane Doe, but thanks to his DNA upload, we were able to identify his missing, many times removed cousin.
It is tremendous. It really is. And it speaks to the advancements in technology. I'd like you maybe to delve a little bit deeper into that because what would have been available those many years ago has changed so much since.
I mean, the difference between now and the 1980s is immense. You know, often it can be easy sometimes to look back in cases from the 1980s and say, how come this mistake was made? But at the time, investigators were working with what they had. For example, the age estimate in this case, they were pretty off. 35 to 45, and she ended up being 71. But the tools available to anthropologists, to investigators, and whatnot, back then it was a hell of a lot trickier. And nowadays we have the benefit of things like advanced DNA technologies, which helped reveal Dorothy's ethnicity. And then we had members of the public who had been willing to upload their DNA to databases we can use, which allowed us through a convoluted, complicated process of building family trees and whatnot to actually home in on this woman who, again, it turns out had gone missing from Chicago. So the technology that we have nowadays is what's allowing us to make these strides. I hope in the years to come there are future technological developments that allow us to make even more progress on some of these John and Jane Doe cases that have gone unsolved for so long.
Yeah, and I feel like, there's has to be mixed feelings when a family gets that type of information decades later. Maybe some feelings of closure that you feel good about it from that standpoint of at least you have some answers now, but at the same time, finally knowing that your relative met that type of demise. Are there any other cases that really stand out to you that you all have worked on?
There was one case that I worked on a number of years back, and it was the case of a man named Johnny, what we now know to be Johnny Brandenburg. He was actually from Chicago. He was a victim of a serial killer, Larry Eiler, and we identified him very quickly. It only took 5 days, and his mother had been waiting 40 years to learn what happened to him. And when the coroner went and delivered the news to her, was the awful news that your teenage son was the victim of a serial killer, but she had gone so many years without answers, and she told the coroner when he informed her of the news, "I've waited 40 years to know what happened to Johnny, and now I finally know what happened. I can rest." So I think a lot of the time, even when a family might not get closure, so to speak, from answers in a case like this, they at least have those answers. There's no more of this ambiguous loss that they deal
Mm-hmm.
with. They know what happened to their loved one, and they can grieve them properly, knowing that they have passed away, but knowing what happened to them.
Absolutely. And speaking more about the closure for families, what is the reaction when you interact with a family along the way? I mean, at what point do you all talk to the family about what you all do on a regular basis, and what is their typical response to you all getting on board for a case?
So I say it's relatively uncommon for us to interact with direct relatives of a John or Jane Doe fairly frequently, but there was recently a documentary series that came out about our work with Naming the Dead. It was a six-part series, and it focused on six cases of John or Jane Does that the DNA Doe Project had worked on and identified. And the families of those people were interviewed for that show. That was interesting to us as an organization. We had never really seen the families' immediate reactions before, and it was kind of broadly a pretty positive response, all things considered, in terms of yes, we have this loved one who's been missing for all this time. Yes, we now know that they're not going to walk back through the door. But for a lot of those people, they'd already come to terms with the fact that
Mm-hmm.
their loved one had passed away. They just didn't know how or where. So to have those answers for them brought a real sense of relief, I think, for a lot of people. That's a reaction we often, not always, but often tend to see with people when they finally have those answers.
Yeah, and how can people help with you all's mission? I can hear, some dollar signs in my head when it comes to resources, and how do you all fund these missions that might take quite a bit of time?
So what makes the DNA Doe project rather unique is that we actually do all of the genealogy research pro bono. Agencies don't pay a cent for the work that we do, and regardless of whether it takes 10 hours or 10,000 hours, as it sometimes does, to identify a John or Jane Doe, we will put in that work. The costly part is the lab fees to actually get to the point where we can work on these cases. You have to send the samples to a lab. They need to undergo extraction, sequencing, costly scientific steps that often are quite, money intensive. So we would encourage people to go to DNADoeProject.org and consider making a donation if you'd like to help support our mission and ensure that others can be reunited with their identities. I would also say that for anyone out there who's taken the consumer DNA test, think 23andMe, MyHeritage, companies like that, you can actually then download your DNA data, and if you'd like to, upload your DNA profile to DNA Justice or GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. These are the three databases that we have access to for our work. And even if you have no idea of any missing people in your family, it's not something that's been on your radar, you might have a third cousin out there in a completely different part of the US who has been missing for decades. And by uploading your DNA, you could be that crucial match that actually allows us to identify that distant missing relative of yours. You just never know.
Is your work typically welcomed by police departments?
We've been met with a pretty positive reception by more or less everyone we've worked with, to be fair. I think as the years have gone on, police departments and coroner's officers too have become much keener as they become more comfortable with this technology to embrace the usage of what we do. So we work very well with our law enforcement partners, and I'm always glad to see new police departments, coroner's officers, medical examiners, and so forth embracing this technology because it really is providing answers in a lot of cases where otherwise you just wouldn't get that resolution.
Yeah, and absolutely. You identify a person, but then there could end up being a court case afterward once you've identified who the person is. Has that happened several times for you all?
I can think of a couple of cases actually where we've identified a John or Jane Doe, and often much later down the line, that has later led police to clues that have allowed them to then make an arrest when that John or Jane Doe is a victim of homicide. Some of our victims have died of natural causes, others may have taken their own lives, some have died in natural disasters. But in those cases where the John or Jane Doe is a victim of homicide, yeah, knowing that person's name is often a crucial step for investigators to then find out who did this to them and bring them to justice.
Yeah, well, thank you for the work that you all do in helping so many families out there. How many cases have you all helped to solve at this point?
We have solved about just over 150. I received word shortly before the school that we've just solved another.
Oh, wow.
So we are literally cracking these every other day at this point. And I look forward to solving 150 more in the months and years to come.
Absolutely. Do you have any details about the one that you all just solved that you want to tell us about?
I'm afraid because it was literally solved a matter of hours ago, we haven't had the chance to confirm it or anything else yet. But later down the line, we hope to share more details. And we certainly have more confirmation identifications coming all the time.
Sure. Come on back on the show when you have an update, especially if it comes back here to Chicago, like this case of 71-year-old Dorothy Glanton. Thank you again for what you all do for so many families.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely.